Here we are, we're studying Freud, and we're looking at Sigmund Freud specifically, who came up with a theory of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud is quite interesting as a as a doctor, first of all, because he came up with a lot of the theories that most psychologists kind of carried forward for the better part of the early last century, and then we're talking about the 1900s. So when he developed his theories, a lot of people went, "Wow, that's brilliant, Sigmund," and they kind of carried on his work. And most of the foundations of modern psychology have their roots in Sigmund Freud's theories. So quickly, Sigmund Freud was born in Austria. He was a very intelligent young man, and he ended up going to medical school as a young man, and he graduated from medical school, and he went on to find out that as a doctor he was coming across problems and patients who were basically having a very, very hard time with what he saw as being non-physical ailments. And so what that means is that people would come in and say, Dr. Freud, and remember, Dr. Freud at the time was not a psychologist, he was a medical doctor. And so people would come in and say, I'm paralyzed. And he'd say, well, I don't find anything wrong with you. And a lot of people have had a problem like this, even in the modern day. Well, they go to the doctor and say, I've got this pain, doctor, I've got this issue, doctor. And the doctor says, I've run a whole bunch of tests and I see nothing physically wrong with you. And so Freud encountered this problem. And what he did was then he started to wonder if perhaps that a lot of these problems might not have been physical in their nature, but rather would have been something that is deeper, something more attached to the brain, but not so much the brain, but rather the mind. And so he theorized, as you see right there, he theorized that many physical problems are psychological in their origin. What does that mean? Fundamentally, what that means is that oftentimes we have physical manifestations or physical problems present themselves physically, but they have no physical symptoms or signs. And so what you end up seeing is your mind over your matter. And we've talked about mind over matter in the sense that your brain has enough of an impact and an influence on a person, on you, that it can make you sick. You can make yourself physically sick without having anything wrong with you physically, but you could make yourself physically sick just by simply experiencing some painful emotions or seeing something traumatic. And so Freud came up with the idea of psychological problems causing physical issues. And so here you said, people are unaware, and most people don't say, wow, my brain is making, I'm not a hypochondriac, they'll tell you. That's not me, it doesn't bother me. When Freud would argue otherwise, he would in fact say that perhaps you don't know because it's buried deep in your unconscious mind. And so Freud then starts to break down the mind. Well, the brain is the brain, and we've kind of looked at the different parts of the brain and what different parts of the brain do. But in many ways, he never really, wanted to concern himself with the brain. He was more interested in the mind, and so that's the non-physical part of the brain. And so he came up with this idea that your brain is basically these three, I'm not going to say conflicting, but sometimes conflicting aspects of the brain. And he called them the ego, the superego, and the id. And notice here it says they're not physical. In other words, you can't open up somebody's head, physically open up their skull, point to the brain and go, ah, yes, the ego is right there, and just tap that part of the brain. This is a non-physical thing. And so when Freud came up with this idea, people were like, well, Freud, you're kind of crazy, no pun intended, but let's be serious. Now, I'm going to give you a little side note. If anyone's in or is taking philosophy or has taken philosophy, Freud's idea of having three influences is very much, we're not going to call it a copy, a direct copy, but he kind of took a notion that Plato had, a long time ago, much longer than Freud was around, or far before Freud was around. And he had this idea that you have these three different parts of your spirit or your soul that are in conflict for your control of your body. And so Freud had the same idea that you have the ego, the superego, and the id, and these are three conflicting parts of your mind that are basically trying to get you to do one thing or another. And I'll get into that in a sec. So the first one he called the ego, and the ego was the conscious and rational mind. It's you. In the simplest terms, it is you. It's you, how you are, where you are, what you're doing, what you're thinking at this moment. And so the ego is yourself, the self that you present to the world. The id is the oldest part of your mind, and interestingly enough, a part of the unconscious mind. Now, interesting to note that people are born with just an id, according to Freud. Your id is your desire, your instinct, your biological drives. And so most babies, when they're born with an id. They're not concerned about, for example, how are people viewing me right now. I really hope I'm making an excellent impression on the people watching me, would say a baby, if it had more than just an id. If a baby's hungry, it wants to eat, it'll cry. If a baby sneezes, it won't cover its mouth, it won't worry about, well, am I spreading my germs, it'll just sneeze. If a baby is going to burp or perform any bodily function, they'll do it without even a second thought, saying, well, I would like to pee right now, but you're all watching me, so I won't. Right? The id is just like, deal with it. I have a physical problem, I'm just going to deal with it because that's what I need. This is what my biological drive is. So if I'm going to pee, I'm going to pee now. If I'm going to poop right now. I'm going to have to do it in my diaper, so be it. If I'm hungry, I'm going to cry my face off till somebody feeds me. Right? And so you'll see here it's all about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And think of a baby, right? It won't concern itself whether its mother is ready to feed it. A baby won't be deeply concerned if someone's not there to change it. It's basically saying, someone's going to change me now. I don't care who. Somebody's got to change me. I just covered my diaper and whatever, or filled my diaper with whatever. And the idea that it's out of touch with reality is that whole idea. When I say reality, it's really just satisfy me, satisfy my urges and my needs now. And that is an id thing. Later on, as we age, the id kind of gets pushed back and the ego takes the forefront. And the id starts to go back in those wishful dreams that Freud believed were the id kind of basically trying to get out. The id kind of saying, listen to me, listen to me. And the superego is the unconscious mind, the second part of the unconscious mind that's in conflict with the id. And it's the conscience. It's that little voice telling you, well, you really shouldn't do that. And it's probably not a good idea. And what would people think? And what would mother think? Or what would father say? And so this notion that perhaps you have that little voice, that little in the back of your mind is telling you, don't do that. That's your superego. And so your superego is very much like, and you'll see coming up in an example, your superego is that little angel on your shoulder, right? Who's telling you, no, don't do that. And your id would be the devil on your shoulder, basically saying, yeah, come on, do it, it's fun, do the fun thing. And the superego is like, don't do fun, do what's right. And the ego is you kind of scenario deciding which one do I follow. And amazingly enough, the more impaired you become, the more your id starts to come out, right? And so people who, for example, and I'm pretty sure that many of you, are not into drinking heavily on weekends and partying. But if you were, because there's a time and place for that, and it's usually when you're in university, or if you know people who are in university who often partake in excessive alcohol consumption, you'll find out that they'll do stupid things. They'll say, well, I did a lot of really stupid stuff because I was drunk. And the idea is that your ego is kind of pushed back and your inhibitions are gone and the ids come out like, yeah, it's time to party, right? And so your id kind of does a lot of silly things. I'm going to say silly, because it's now at the forefront, right? Your ego's kind of been pushed back, your superego has been pushed way back, and the id comes out to play. And so that's how it works out, according to Freud. So I mentioned this before. When you're born, your mind has only an id. It's all about desire and feed me and give me and whatever I want. And as you age, and there have been other theorists who've been they've added to this notion where they'll say at a certain age you start to develop morals and beliefs and standards and so forth. And so the id and the ego and the superego start to develop slowly. And eventually the ego takes the forefront and the superego for most people kind of becomes, the backseat driver and the id's kind of packed into the trunk. But every so often when the id comes out, things get a little messy. And so that's basically it. Now, that's Freud's theory in a nutshell. So where does that take us? Well, how does that contribute to psychoanalysis and psychological disorders? Interestingly enough, Freud said that this internal conflict between the ego and the superego and the id is that problem that we have where when you have this internal conflict, when you have these three conflicting aspects of your mind going at it, somebody's going to get suppressed and it has to find a way out. It's almost like you have to let the air out of a balloon, or you have to depressurize, because if you don't, something bad's going to happen. Something's going to explode. And so, though Freud never said, feed the id, let the id run out and play, he did kind of say, yeah, but there are times when you kind of have to give in to some of your id urges before it kind of gets so deeply buried that eventually something really bad is going to take place. So there it is, right? That internal conflict that I was mentioning before is finding the balance between, and this little diagram kind of lays it out. And if you haven't seen The Emperor's New Groove, you will in a minute, because I kind of took a clip from that. And you'll see that the conflict between the three is what really causes psychological turmoil, according to Freud.
Guess where I am right now? Uh-huh. In the bag. Still think I'm not the victim here? Watch. It gets better. Oh, he's doing his own theme music? Big, dumb, and tone deaf. I am so glad I was unconscious for all of this.
Mission accomplished.
You're not just gonna let him die like that, are you?
My shoulder, Angel.
Don't listen to that guy. He's trying to lead you down the path of righteousness. I'm going to lead you down the path that rocks.
Oh, come off it.
You come off it.
You.
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 You infinity.
Ah.
Listen up, big guy. I got 3 good reasons why you should just walk away. Number 1. Look at that guy. He's got that sissy stringy music thing.
We've been through this. It's a harp, and you know it.
All right. That's a harp. And that's a dress.
Robe.
Reason number 2. Look what I can do.
What? What does that have to do with anything?
No. He's got a point.
Listen, you guys. You're sort of confusing me, so, be gone. Or, however I get rid of you guys.
That'll work.
What's with the chimp and the bug? Can we get back to me?
And so there you have it. It's a pretty comical way of looking at the ego, the superego, and the id, but you kind of get the idea. And this notion, and it's been played up in different cartoons and different films where you have the two sides kind of battling for the egos, or for you being the ego, for your actions. So are you going to follow the bad actions, or are you going to take the path of righteousness, so to speak? And so when you look at how Freud played out his notion of the ego, the superego, and the id, what he said is that you've got the conscious mind, which is up here. Well, not he, but other people kind of compared it to an iceberg. And if you know anything about icebergs, you know that the majority of the iceberg sits under the water. And there's a bit of the iceberg that shows up, and in some cases it's a lot. It looks like a lot. So some people have big personalities and even bigger buried below the surface. But generally speaking, for most people, and you see here, your thoughts and perceptions sit at the conscious level. And then you move things into the pre-conscious level, according to Freud, which is your memory and your knowledge. And this stuff we kind of covered in the Intro to Psychology lectures, 1 and 2. And so this is you. This is who you are. But then deep, deep below the surface, according to Freud, is your unconscious mind. And here you have, and if you can see very clearly, but it says things like fears and unacceptable sexual desires. And Freud, if you do some reading on the guy, he was like all about sex. Like everything was a repressed sexual desire for one's mother. And Freud was kind of weird in that sense, because no matter what happened, it was all about, you have an Oedipus complex as a man. You probably just want to have sex with your mother, and you're having a hard time coming to grips with that. And people are like, "What, dude? What are you talking about? I like my mother. I mean, I love her, but not in that way." And Freud's like, "Really? Is that it? Are you sure? Don't you have dreams about your mother? And people are like, no, I don't." And he's like, "I think you're just suppressing your urges." And people are like, no, you're making me feel crazy now the way you're talking, but no, I don't feel that. And so Freud had a lot of these very deep-seated, weird things that he would say to people. And some of them would be. I mean, you have people often have said that, if you would arrest someone for the thoughts that they had, a lot of people would be spending time in jail. I mean, people say it all the time, well, they won't tell people, but in their minds, like, "Well, I just love to punch that person right in the face," and they just kind of bury it in that deep unconscious mind. And so that's where you see the violent motives and the immoral urges, right, and the selfish needs, and all this stuff, according to Freud, gets buried deep, way below the surface, and it stays there. The problem is that if you experience something up here, and you're kind of forcing it down here, what ends up happening is this stuff has to find a way out, according to Freud. And sometimes it pushes its way up. And even though you don't realize it, not all the way up here, but it shows itself up here, but you don't understand it, because the disconnect between here and here, according to Freud, is pretty deep. And it takes a lot of digging for you to dig from the surface to work all your way down here. And so that was Freud's psychoanalysis idea, where I can dig below the surface and we'll scratch way beyond the surface and really get to know, maybe you've got these fears that are showing themselves up, and they're causing your brain to not function properly. And so this is the Freud's model. Again, you can look at this over and at your leisure. The lecture is there for you to see. But the idea is that you've got the part of your brain that you basically don't really understand. It's there, the part of your mind that you don't understand. It's there, and it shows itself. And so Freud would do psychoanalysis, which was he'd get people to lay on a couch, and it'll be coming up on the next slide. And so I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but then he would talk about this idea of, okay, if we talk enough, I could probably get to find out more about what these feelings are that you're suppressing. And so he did that, and you see the little sketch here, the little picture where some guy's sitting here and somebody's laying on a couch. And I'm sure you've seen it in TV and movies where people will go see a therapist, and the therapist is sitting in a chair and the person's laying on a couch. And the person's saying, "Doc, I've got these problems." And the doctor's like, "Go on, tell me what these problems are." And the person's like, "Well, it's all started with this, and that." And then the person would say to the therapist, "Well, what do you think?" And then this therapist says, "Well, what do you think?" Right? And so it's all about the person laying on the couch talking, and the therapist just kind of jotting notes and ideas and trying to make connections with what the person is saying with something that would have a psychoanalytic result. And so if the person talks about, as they talk more and more about their deep fear of flying, for example. And if you've seen this episode of The Simpsons, you'll know what I'm talking about, where Marge she can't fly. And so she goes and sees a psychotherapist who kind of does this Freudian psychoanalysis, and they talk and they talk and they talk. And eventually, as Marge becomes more comfortable and lets her guard down, so the ego starts to kind of relax a bit, and the superego starts to relax a bit, because the ego and the superego don't want anyone to know what the id is saying, right? And they don't want to let the id out, so they often block and hide things. And so, eventually as Marge relaxes and tells the doctor, she's like, well, actually when I was a little kid, I found out that my father was a flight attendant and it was really shameful and blah, blah, blah. And that's the root of her fear of flying, is because she went on a plane accidentally and saw her father, who was a flight attendant, and she always believed that he was a pilot, whatever. But so there's your deep psychoanalytical issue that the Freudian therapist came up with. And so how did he do this? Well, he did it through several things. One of them was hypnosis. The belief that if you hypnotize someone, you can dig into their unconscious mind and there's no real barrier. Other things they would do is free association. And free association is actually quite interesting because it's kind of a word game where someone will say a word and the person who's being analyzed will say the first thing that comes to their mind. So someone says dog, the person says cat, someone says up, the other person says down, the person says cow, the person says beef. Someone says, hockey, somebody says puck to the face. And you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Why would you say puck to the face when I said hockey? And you're like, well, when I was 2, I got hit in the face with a puck. And you're like, well, there we go. Now we understand what your deep fear of ice is. And now we've come to the root of the problem, and now we can start to address that. So it's not just a matter of I figured out what my problem is, but rather we figure out what the problem is and how can we get you over this problem. And another thing that he did was also dream analysis. Now, dreams are a very, very interesting animal because in order to analyze a dream, and if you want to do dream analysis, by all means, just Google dream analysis. And they will come up with, I don't know how many, tens of thousands of sites where you could pretty much type in anything about a dream and it'll tell you what it means. And people have dreams all the time. And I've done this in many classes where I do the lecture and hands go up and someone's like, the other day I had a dream that, I was riding a horse and there was an alligator beside me and the alligator tried to attack me and I punched it in the face and it ate my horse and I ran away. And you're like, and they're looking at me saying, what does that mean? And I look at them and go, yeah, I'm not a doctor. I have no idea what that means. But feel free to Google it because I'm sure something will come up. And you can, and you'll Google it and all these things will come up. The horse means that you're feeling stable and the alligator means you have a problem that's looming or whatever. Is it bogus? I think so. Is there some validity to it? I think so. Would I stake my medical license on it? Probably not. But Freud did. Freud believed that the dreams are the id's way of expressing itself. And so why is that important? Well, it is important if you're looking at a Freudian type of psychoanalysis because in Freud's mind, when he was still alive, the idea is that, if I can talk to your id, and that was the hypnosis idea, or if I can get you to let your guard down through free association, or if I can really get right in there and find out what your dreams are saying, then I can start to piece together what these problems are that are buried in your past. Today, we look at a lot of this Freudian theory, or a lot of these Freudian theories, and in many ways, we see manifestations, or we see these expressions in things like post-traumatic stress disorder or phobias, where people have like a deep fear of something. And it usually has its roots somewhere in somebody's history, or something went terribly wrong in somebody's past that they've suppressed the memory and they just kind of forget that it's there. But the memory is there and the experience is there. And you can't erase an experience, according to Freud. So as long as the experience is there and it stays buried in the back of your mind, it will always kind of come back to poke at you or to prevent you from doing something or to scare you or to, paralyze you with fear. And that's why people have phobias, for example, where at some point in their history something terrible happened to them. Pretty common is a dog, right? So when people have any kind of fear of dogs, usually that comes into play because at some point in their childhood or history they had a very, very bad experience with a dog and it just spiraled from there, right? So now even someone in their 50s, 60s, 70s sees a dog, that phobia is very, very powerful, very strong, and many people will act out. They'll almost become paralyzed with fear if they see a dog. And to some people who aren't afraid of dogs, it's kind of like, well, grow a pair, buddy. I mean, it's a dog. But it's a very real and paralyzing fear for a lot of people. And so it's easy to stand from an outsider's perspective and say, come on, it's just a dog. But if you've had a very bad experience, and that bad experience is almost like a bacteria just sat in the back of your mind and festered and festered and festered and festered, well, then that little bacterial infection has now become a massive bacterial infection, kind of draw a parallel, and it's debilitating. Like it is paralyzing. Anyway, that's the Freud lecture. It's pretty much as condensed as I could possibly make it. I'll post a Freud reading with some questions. You don't have to actually do it immediately right now, but some of the stuff that you'll see on the quiz in a couple days will be from Freud. So keep in mind that you don't necessarily have to do the questions immediately, but it would be a good idea to kind of go through, fire them off, put them in the Dropbox so at least I know you've done the Freud stuff and you kind of have a pretty good idea with it. And that's really because where we're going with the psychology unit, and we're going to be ending it soon, where it's going to end up is in your summative. There's one aspect where you're going to have to actually psychoanalyze somebody. And that's kind of an interesting thing. By the same token, if you've ever seen a show called My Strange Addiction, that is I'm going to say 90% Freudian stuff, where if you've watched the show or if you catch an episode here or there, and I'll see if I can track one down and post it for you to have a look at, but you can totally psychoanalyze somebody based on what their behaviors are. And that was Freud's thing, right? Like if I can get enough of your behaviors or enough of what's going on in your head, I could pretty much figure out what happened to you in the past, and we can fix that or we can address that. And if you turn and face it and deal with it, it's kind of gone. Okay, have a good one. Stuff will be forthcoming shortly. And that's it. That's all.